Davante Lewis, Louisiana Budget Project, Albert Samuels with Southern University.
Thank you, Mr. Acting Chair. My name is Davante Lewis, the Director of Public Affairs at the Louisiana Budget Project, and we are opposed to this piece of legislation. Part of our organization's work is bringing policy that affects low and moderate income families, and we have come to the conclusion that we cannot talk about policy if we do not talk about the structural racism that has existed in the United States. I used to be an elementary school teacher, and one of the things I always told my students is when you come before me, please do your homework and talk about facts. And sadly, this debate today has shown this legislation didn't do its homework and is not centered on facts. The fact is, America and Louisiana has been historically racist, and that structural racism did exist, continues to exist, and until we dismantle public policy, will exist in the future. One of the things we are here in this session is about tax policy. And when we talk about structural racism, we have to also talk about history. And so we know in Louisiana we have a 2/3 majority to pass any tax. The first 2/3 majority came in 1890 in the state of Mississippi when they had a constitutional convention. And the delegate that introduced the 2/3 majority said the reason I am supporting this policy is so that the Negro never has political power. The simple fact of our tax structure, when I say Louisiana's tax structure is systematically and structural racism, exists in history. But under this bill, if I was in the classroom, it would be very hard to present that information. Now, that's not to say that when you enact a tax policy with the 2/3 majority, you are being racist. But what it means is that the education required to understand how this public policy affects different races has to be part of the discussion. And so part of the problem with this piece of legislation is it really searches for a problem, as we've heard, that doesn't exist. We talked about dialogue, and the Louisiana Budget Project committed to racial dialogue. We joined Dr. Samuels here at the table with me and the LSU Riley Center and the NAACP, the LSU Diversity Office, and Southern University in a conversation about what is race. We started there. We started talking about that. And then we had a conversation about whiteness. We've talked a lot about personal feelings, but part of systematic and structural racism is not the personal action. It is the structure that favors whiteness, not a white person. And when we had that conversation and we started the dialogue on campuses, the chairman sent an email to the Board of Regents asking if this was the official policy and did not approve of it. So when we are talking about dialogue and trying to have the conversations, we cannot be hypocritical in the actions that we take. We believe that the best way to improve education is to be in the radical business of telling the truth. And the truth of this state, the truth of this nation, the truth of our history is that racism has been at the forefront of public policy. And in fact, this piece of legislation is not undoing systematic racism, it is embedding it right back into the law that we have so far tried to take away. And so I would conclude in saying the ways we can improve this piece of legislation, one, I would think, is removing it from the files of the House, because I think it dishonors the legacy of trying to solve problems in American history. But if we want to go a step further, I think we can adopt policies that we've seen other states do. The state of Maine is being proactive in their public policy and adding racial impact studies to every proposed piece of legislation, so we're having these conversations in real time, not after legislation is passed. And so with that, Mr. Acting Chair, on behalf of the Louisiana Budget Project, we believe that we can no longer talk about race neutrality and policy because there is no such thing as a race neutral policy. Thank you.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on what time it is. My name is Dr. Albert Samuels. I'm a professor of political science at Southern University. I also chair the Department of Political Science and History, where I've been teaching since 1999. I'm also coming in my capacity I'm also a member of the steering committee for the racism dismantling the systems series that was a collaboration between the Nelson Mandela College of Government and Social Science at Southern University, the LSU's Riley Center on Media and Public Affairs, LSU's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the Louisiana Budget Project, and the Louisiana Conference of the NAACP. I am speaking in terms of what my views are. My views are not a reflection of the views of the institution. I come here today to oppose House Bill 564, which is a sweeping piece of legislation which will have an enormously negative impact on public education from kindergarten to post-secondary education if enacted into law. Now, HB 564 prohibits the discussion of quote-unquote divisive concepts about racism and sexism in Louisiana schools. This legislation specifically forbids educators from teaching students that the United States is, quote, systematically racist or systematically sexist, unquote. It further bars teachers and professors from teaching that American capitalism is systematically racist or sexist. In addition, the legislation targets diversity and inclusion programs at predominantly white institutions for special scrutiny to ensure that they are not discriminating in violation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Now, finally, this legislation requires educational governing authorities to develop policies to discipline faculty or staff members who violate the provision of this act. Penalties can include reprimand, suspension, or termination of employment. So for the reason I'm about to set forth, HB 564 would affect unspeakable harms to public education and free discourse and deserves to be defeated. Now I want to put on my constitutional law professor hat just for a second. In the first place, HB 564 is a frontal assault on the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. Although this bill claims to be aimed at promoting freedom of speech and diverse viewpoints, this legislation singles out specific points of view which are to be prohibited. Viewpoint discrimination is facially unconstitutional. You cannot discriminate in law based on viewpoints. This legislation is also overbroad, which also is a First Amendment violation because it goes further than what is necessary to accomplish its purpose. It is also unconstitutionally vague, meaning that there are provisions that are so unclear that it's not actually clear what conduct is being outlawed. So you have those things, constitutional violations. If this is enacted into law, I can assure you that there will be a constitutional challenge to its legality. Secondly, this legislation violates the principle of academic freedom, a core principle that is fundamental to the academic enterprise. Academic freedom creates the free space for educators to think, write, speak, research subjects, to choose the appropriate methods of instruction and scientific inquiry, free from political interference. This is the necessary precondition for and that creates the optimal environment for intellectual discovery and the free market of ideas. HB 564 circumscribes, with respect to very specific subjects, what faculty may teach, how faculty may teach them. Moreover, this legislation would require educational institutions to enact and enforce policies that violate the academic freedoms of their educators, which contrary to what was offered by some supporters of the bill, this would raise significant accreditation issues if we were to do this. Our accrediting bodies specifically require us to protect the academic freedom of our educators. We just went through an accreditation process. Southern University passed our accreditation with no negative recommendations. That's like going through an institutional rectal exam. We succeeded. A lot of people, a lot of work went into that. And so for us to have legislation that jeopardizes all of the man hours and woman hours that went into that, that is very disconcerting, and for no good reason. Now, the fact that it's said that we're taking higher education off the table, which is not actually accurate, because our education is involved in dual education programs right now, still doesn't solve or dispose of the constitutional problems that I just mentioned. Now, this legislation represents a backlash to the proliferation of current discussions about systematic racism and sexism, which has gained a new urgency in the past year in the wake of the disparate impact of COVID-19 pandemic has had on Black and brown communities, and the fallout from the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. In fact, this series, which I spoke about, was in part a reaction and response to really both of those events. And so the conversations that spawned were both timely, necessary, and long overdue. Now, to be sure, we have made remarkable progress with respect to living up to the ideals of our founding creed. And that should be celebrated. But it's also true that our ability to overcome the lingering effects of our original sin are hampered to some degree by a long tradition of denialism about the basic facts of American history. HB 564, by banning discussion of divisive concepts about racism and sexism, perpetuates this tradition. This is true because HB 564 prohibits educators from making any student uncomfortable on the basis of his race or gender. Now, this may seem to have a neutral purpose, this has a pernicious effect when it comes to actual candid discussions about race and gender. Because basically what it does is that it gives, quite frankly, white students who were offended by discussions or instructional materials about racism and sexism the power to shut down these kinds of conversations. Ironically, white teachers, administrators, students have made black students uncomfortable for years. Practices which continue to this day. Female students have and continue to be made uncomfortable in educational environments dominated by unchallenged male patriarchy. We only need to look at the current revelations at LSU about sexual harassment to understand that we still got a long way to go to root sexism out of our institutions. But black students can get made uncomfortable for decades. Women can lodge complaints of systemic gender bias and have that go unaddressed for years. But if white male students are made uncomfortable, that is unacceptable. That must be addressed. That cannot be allowed to continue. So this legislation reeks of an egregious double standard. And this really points to what's really fundamentally flawed about this particular law, because it interjects inappropriate considerations into the instructional process. See, in the classroom, what's important is not necessarily whether a concept is divisive or not, but what's true. What's the best science? What's the best evidence? Should teachers not teach For example, that slavery was the central cause of the Civil War? Because that is now the consensus view of American historians. Should we not teach that because some people consider it divisive? And how are our students benefited? How does that serve the public interest to withhold that information from our students? In fact, effective instruction sometimes necessarily requires students to be made uncomfortable at times. But this would cause professors, teachers to second guess themselves, having a chilling effect on their speech and their pedagogy. And how do we decide what's divisive anyway with respect to racism and sexism so that they can't be taught? And this also, if enacted in law, lays a predicate for labeling other subjects as divisive. It's easy to imagine someone saying, you know what, I don't believe that we ought to teach climate change in schools because some people think that's divisive. And we can ignore the fact that 97% of climate science, this is not a debate anymore. But just because some people don't like it or think it's divisive, we don't teach it in our schools. Finally, HB 6564 turned the Civil Rights Act on its head, which was designed to outlaw race and sex discrimination. This legislation circumscribes discussion and dialogue about the vestiges of the very discrimination that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was meant to remedy. Instead, it focuses unwarranted scrutiny on diversity and inclusion programs at PWIs, ostensibly to make sure that these programs are not engaging in discrimination on the basis of race and gender. But that focus is misguided. It targets the diversity and inclusion programs, which, quite frankly, are a small fraction of the budget anyway, rather than the educational institutions whose historic and current discriminatory practices have made them necessary in the first place. This perpetuates the false claim that is reflected in many recent polls that white Americans today experience just as much, if not more, racial discrimination as blacks do today. HB 564 would codify this falsehood into public law. Therefore, for all these reasons, I contend this is a bad piece of legislation and it should be defeated. It is a blatant assault on the First Amendment of the Constitution. It inappropriately encroaches upon the academic freedom of educators in ways that stifle scholarly debate. It is true that racism and sexism are difficult things to talk about. And sometimes these discussions are difficult to navigate. But HB 564 suggests that educators, despite their years of professional preparation, cannot be trusted to exercise their professional judgment with respect to how to engage in these kinds of discussions. Moreover, it denies students the full benefit of our professional expertise by censoring consideration of certain topics from the classroom. Now, it might be uncomfortable and unpleasant to uncritically examine the ugly facts of our nation's history and how they continue to affect contemporary American society. But we do our students, who are the future leaders of our country and our democracy, no favors by shutting down candid conversations about the nature of our history and our current problems. To the contrary, we actually affirm our highest ideals when we not only celebrate the laudatory elements of our history, of which there are many, but when we forthrightly and courageously confront our shortcomings so that we do not repeat the mistakes of the past. That is the highest form of patriotism. And so I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Samuels.